Namaste and welcome to Pods by PI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneursing. I am Hriday Sapkota. In today's episode, PI colleague Susab Nirola is in conversation with Sri Lankan investigative journalist Dilrukshi Handunnetti on Thinking Sri Lanka, recalling legacies of conflict, domestic politics and aid. Dilrukshi is an international award-winning investigative journalist and a lawyer from Sri Lanka. She has worked extensively across South Asia as an on-ground reporter and trainer. As an investigative journalist, she has broken stories on grand corruption and crime, conflict and communities, and dedicated significant time to reporting on women, children, health, and the environment. As a recipient of many prestigious journalism fellowships, she won the coveted WAS Media Award in 2014. She was also the Sri Lankan Journalist of the Year in 2012. Susab and Dilrukshi discuss Sri Lanka's complex socio-political history, including its violent ethnic conflict and colonial legacy, exploring the roles of various events in shaping its identity. Drawing simultaneously from her work and her lived experience of the war, Dilrukshi illustrates the political roots of the conflict, reflecting on civil war's impact and quest for ethnic minority rights, including the rise of groups like the LTTE. They also examine international influence, notably from India, China, and the West, on Sri Lanka's political landscape and review its governance challenges, human rights issues, and economic reforms. The dialogue concludes on the reflections on Sri Lanka's civic space, civil society, press freedom, and the broader South Asian context of handling dissent and nurturing democratic spaces. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hi, I'm Susa.
Hi, Dilrukshi. Lovely to be here.
Great to have you here. Hi all, welcome to the podcast by PEI. Recently, PEI hosted a regional dialogue on ideas. Here we discuss issues ranging from federalism, migration, doing business in Nepal, civil society in South Asia, amongst others. Dilrukshi was principally here for that. But I couldn't resist the opportunity of her presence to discuss about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka and Nepal share a lot in common. Issues like ethnic politics, conversation around post-war or post-conflict reconciliation, managing relationship between India and China, conversations around donors and development, common questions regarding accountability and corruptions with our respective governments. These are questions that we share. I understand that we cannot cover all these conversations in one setting. We'll focus around the issue of ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, but alongside doing that, we'll also touch on other common aspects that we, Nepal and Sri Lanka, share. So let's get right at it. For our Nepali listeners especially, can you share a bit of history about Sri Lanka? By that I mean, when does the period of modern nation state of Sri Lanka, as we know today, begin from? Is it 1948 when Sri Lanka became independent from the Britishers? Or are there other crucial points?
Well, Sri Lanka is one of the oldest democracies in South Asia, but the modern nation state, as you mentioned, dates back to 1948. And we were colonized by the British, and following Indian independence, a few months later, Sri Lanka was also declared independent. And different to Indian independence struggle, Sri Lanka was very different. Sri Lankan independence struggle was an intellectual one. That was about bargaining with the British and using India to leverage. And there was no bloodletting in Sri Lanka. But I think we were beneficiaries of the Indian struggle. And so the modern state was born in 1948.
Before 1948, were you guys divided into small kingdoms, or were you
Yes, we were. We had Ruhunu, Pihiti, and Maya, and provincial kings ruled. So lots being said about power devolution. And I think Sri Lanka knew power devolution when you had provincial kings. But at times, it has been unified by different kings, the entirety of Sri Lanka. But 1948, of course, was a watershed moment, and it created the modern Ceylon, and then we became Sri Lanka.
Getting along this conversation of identity and conflict, I wanted to understand what were the major factors that led to the civil war in 1983? How did that build up? As we know, Sri Lanka's civil war went on from 1983 to 2009 and claimed more than 80,000 lives. So I just wanted to understand what was the starting point of all that conflict, what led to it.
Okay, so that also has some history. And I think besides the territorial question, the language issue has been a huge one. The Sinhala language policy, which was driven by SWRD Bandaranaike, who was a plural man, a Democrat. But I think the politics of the day went against him, and in a weak moment, this policy was introduced. And then, with that single stroke of division, when your language becomes the second best and gets reduced, so I think the language played a huge part. And then we had the Republican Constitution in 1972, and the Tamils also felt that they were losing out a lot through that. And all of that collectively, so it's not one single moment, one single incident. Then in 1976, we saw the proliferation of political groups, dissenters, you can call them resistant groups, and they got armed. The TOLF, Tamil United Liberation Front, was the first. And then there was a crop of other resistant groups, and they got armed, and they got trained in South India. So that it's never really
South
been.
India.
Yes, of course, the camps are in South India, and then you have this whole tension within your country, and there is a real connection to your neighboring country because there is this support for identity, and it drives a certain political interest and even a wedge between the two large ethnic groups in the country. So then we come to 83. So you have resistant groups, and you may call them rebel, whatever, resistant, insurgents, all kinds of terminologies used around them. And then there is this military engagements. In 1983, the LTT, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, killed 13 soldiers. And then the state, the Colombo Sinhala state, made sure that there was a program, obviously, and then there was violence that targeted Tamils. I remember this. I was a kid, and I remember that. And it was so senseless. I never understood, but I still remember the buildings burning. And in my mind, there is still this car turned upwards, and it's like consumed in flames. That whole senselessness of it all and the fear of people, something's really changed that day, that month, 83 July. And I don't think we have ever really rebuilt our relationship.
The language policy, Sinhala only language policy, I think it was recognized as the official language while not giving the similar status to Tamil language, right?
And another issue was also the state was also colonizing. This is how the Tamils would call it, colonizing. The Sinhala governments called it settlement, yeah, and development projects like the Galloy project in the North Central province. So you have people, the Sinhalese, being settled in what the Tamils felt were originally the lands that they occupied.
I see. Now I want to take this conversation and focus on how a particular Tamil militant organization resisted. So you have 1983 civil war starts. From my reading, I see there were a lot of militant organizations, but then LTTE, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, they gain upper hand, and slowly they become the militant organization. They started out as a relatively small guerrilla force, but they went on to resemble this modern forces with having their own military wing, including Navy and airborne units. So from a small guerrilla force to being an organization that resembles a modern armed force, how did they go on about being that force? Because I see the geography of Sri Lanka, it seems pretty secluded, right? And with a majoritarian state, with their power, on face value, it seems that it could have easily gained control, but that didn't happen. It went on for quite a period. The war started at 1983 and ended at 2009, right? So a lot of it was because of the strength of LTTE. So the question to you is, what was the basis of that strength through which they could develop, so advanced and challenge the Sri Lankan state?
So the LTT wanted to be recognized as the sole representative of the Tamil people. And this was resisted by certain other groups.
Tamil groups.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have all these multiple groups and everybody wants to have, a piece of that pie. But the LTT grew in strength and in influence. I think any liberation, organization, they call themselves a liberation front, right? And we may call it by any other name. And I was a journalist and I was actually going to the north and reporting and was also privy to the peace dialogues between the government and the liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. So I have some insights. No movement can take such strong root in any place if there's no civil support. So I think the issue of identity, the issue of deprivation, of political grievances, of living through violence as citizens, civilians, all of that, and being treated as second-class citizens or being denied, are things that contribute to civil unrest and unhappiness. And the LTT came to symbolize those aspirations of the Tamil people. We may not like to hear this, but they definitely gave expression to the people's requirements. And of course, it was a violent group. No, and Tamils were also at the receiving end. You couldn't resist the LTT. They ruled. They had tax systems. And I used to get taxed. So every time I crossed from this end, so that we had this area called the border and their defined border. So you cross that. The speed limit in the rest of the Sri Lanka was different. And driving at 60 was upper limit over there. So I get fined if my van goes at 60. And for me to see a real other state within one country. Now it's interesting, but it was mind-blowing at that time. Yeah, everything changes from the topography, geographically, what it looks like, from the palms to the clothes to how people live. Everything changed. Secondly, I think besides the fact that they had acceptance, whether it was by force or by real, organic support, they had public support. We cannot deny this. And then there was this growing diaspora influence. We have driven people out of our country, Tamils mostly, and some of them ended up in South India as refugees. When the war broke out in 1983, people were taking boats to go to India and seeking refuge. So Sri Lanka has not given protection to all Sri Lankans. And then others who had the leverage of money and education, went to Western countries. And then they funded. Then they supported and they believed in the cause. And so I think the diaspora played a huge role in supporting the LTT. So you're talking about the money, the financial capacity, the military capacity. Let's not also forget our beautiful neighbor. They definitely had a role to play, and it's very well documented. And history has been unkind, I think, my personal take, to Rajiv Gandhi, who was trying to correct something that happened during Mrs. Gandhi's time. And it was possibly too late for him to enter, but he did try. India played a critical role in arming and training the LTT and other groups. So you knew how to use the weapons, and you also had your supply route.
And you said this was mostly during the period of Indira Gandhi.
Well, the beginnings, the training and all that. Since then, when you have the diaspora growing and becoming affluent, the money flows. You know how militant groups function. Yeah, then you have all kinds of other things about trade and narcotics and arms and all of that. LTT was, at its pinnacle at a point.
So what I want to get back now is, you said LTT received support from India, but then I also read how LTT attacked India at one point. So why was that?
Okay, I think there's a small nuance thing
Yeah,
there.
the dynamic between...
When you say support, it was largely the training and the easy passage for armaments. But very quickly, India changed. India had to change. That is also because
Why?
Tamil Nadu is part of India. And it's like, we are separated by 16 kilometers. The proximity. We are closer to Tamil Nadu than Tamil Nadu to Delhi. Yeah. So when in your backyard, there is this growing power of militancy, I think the Indian security state had very good reason to be concerned about the one that they were feeding, in a way. Having said that, so once it was done, again, I think it's also an extension of the divide and rule. India divides and rules. I'm not going to mince my words on this one. It does. All big powers do. Even small countries try. If we can, we also try to get the wedge between something, right? And get the advantage. So it's international politics. But when you do that, you have domestic concerns. And to be fair to India, I think managing Tamil Nadu, a large state, which has its own identity, itself can be very problematic. India is many countries within one country. And in that, all these identities and languages and aspirations of people, it's very difficult to manage. The Tamils are originally from Sri Lankan Tamils, are deeply connected culturally and linguistically to Tamil Nadu. So you would want to be very cautious about that growing identity and intimacy. That's one. And finally, when Colombo wanted to have this discussion and bring the LTT to the table, India played a huge role. The moment India played that role of bringing these two groups together, there was resistance, and the LTT felt that India was changing. This was no longer the pro-LTT or LTT supportive India. And when I say supportive, I want to qualify this word. It's politically, aspirationally supportive, because training phases ended by that time. And then you want to think that the LTT not only resisted, could not probably understand. And I met a lot of Tamil leaders, except for Velupilla Prabhakaran. I've interviewed almost all those leaders. And so when you really unpack the history during peacetime, during the peace talks and ceasefire, I had access to these people and to understand how they were unpacking politics and looking at those historical times when all these things happened. With the Indo-Lanka Accord, which was signed between Rajiv Gandhi and the then Sri Lankan President Jayarjayawardena. Well, let's say Sri Lanka didn't like it, Colombo didn't like it, this didn't like it, people felt we were forced to one, and that India was twisting their arm.
And the Tamils, they liked it?
They didn't too. This is the interesting thing. You did not please any group, right? You were making both groups feel very unhappy about it. And I think, when you live through that moment, and much later only you have that peace of mind to unpack incidents and look at it with some nuance. Even Rajiv Gandhi, I think, had a tough time trying to, find some middle ground. And after the peace accord, so you have conditions. And the LTT strongly resisted. And I think Colombo did not have much opportunity to resist. But I think Jayarjayawardena was very smart at that moment. He also doesn't get credit for some things. We are all very good at criticizing leaders, but when he
was the president then.
At the time, the first executive president of Sri Lanka. So we also had then the IPKF, Indian Peacekeeping Forces, 3,000 boots on the ground. Yeah. This really put the Tamils off India, because now you have Indian troops, Hindi speaking, not Tamil speaking, Hindi speaking, any other language, right, of India. But not necessarily Tamil speaking. This is what people used to tell me. People who are now old and remember the time.
Tamils.
I would say they were not talking our language. So there was a disconnect. And I think after the IPKF and how IPKF went after the LTT, because that was part of the accord, to bring control, to crush the LTT. IPKF played a huge role. There is a monument for the IPKF in Sri Lanka. So we do remember them. Sri Lanka does remember them, and I think Tamils don't want to remember them. So things have changed. There is no one single thread, right, to anything. History is all about these changing threads, and event-based or nuance-based, and our own understanding changes. So when India changed, there was severe resistance to that India from mostly the Tamils, but Sinhalese had got a very contentious relationship with India. They do not trust India largely. They think there is always vested interest. And even yesterday I was saying that there is a lot of historical baggage. And one bit of that baggage, an important piece, is the fact that the arming and the support training of dissenting groups.
Interesting. I think a lot of these things like fall out when we look at binary. So someone who doesn't follow Sri Lankan politics, it's like Sinhala and Tamils fighting. India has Tamil population, so they must be closer. Tamils, But then you have conflict between these groups as well. So I think it's interesting to follow that as well.
Talking about ethnic politics, so Tamil Nadu's ethnic politics would be so close to what we have in the northern part of Sri Lanka. So how can you not show support to the Tamils of Sri Lanka, even when you know you wouldn't want to be one state? It's such a pipe dream. And Delhi has to appease Tamil Nadu too.
Right? Yep. And now moving on to understand Tamil as a group better. Normally, from the outside, there is a tendency to see Tamils as a monolithic category. But based on my cursory reading, there are different subgroups with different identity within that monolithic category. I just wanted to ask and understand what sort of prominent different subgroups have been there. Historically, have these subgroups had similar way of engaging with the Sri Lankan state, or have they been different?
So the subgroup questions?
Within Tamils.
Tamils,
Yeah.
yes. So you have people who were brought from India for the longest period of time. They were called Indian laborers. Can you imagine the language used? It was so condescending. And these people were brought from parts of India and then from largely South India. And then they worked in the plantations. Tea growing British got these people to work. And what happens? Sri Lanka doesn't give them citizenship. And then there is this Sirima Shastri Pact to give them citizenship. And in the 60s, around 300,000 people, Tamils of Indian origin, as they were called, were given citizenship. And another over 500,000 people were returned. So they were repatriated. And the question to date is live. There is a call for fully fledged political rights of this community. So that's the second community. So these are the two main groups.
One who have been there historically and one who British has brought in to work in the plantations. So two main subgroups of Tamils, you
The
mentioned.
second group has not been violent. There's never been any uprising. They have been less than citizens, never really fully treated. Sri Lanka's unspoken people and really the margin.
And within these groups, how did they engage with the state? Was it, logically speaking, some opted parliamentary politics and some opted arms? Was there sort of dynamics there, or they were a single force going through militant route to demand their rights?
So Ceylon Workers' Congress, CWC, became a huge political force. And this was created.
So this is about Tamils who were brought.
Central parts of Sri Lanka.
I see.
Yes.
Yeah.
They became the kingmakers later on. Yeah, in the 80s and early 90s, they were the kingmakers. They got a lot of power, a lot of clout. And in the central parts, you have sizable representation. You represent the working class. Plantation workers were huge numbers. So you have a lot of representation. And they leveraged on that. And they were deciding as to who would gain parliamentary majority. So to that extent, they were very clever. But at the same time, some of them were rich, of course. This is how politics work. But they are the most unserviced people of Sri Lanka. And you have these good indicators about Sri Lanka, right? Our health, our education, our sanitation, all that's good. But not if you look at the plantations. That's that untold story. So even their politicians did not service them, but they used them for votes. So they assimilated and worked with the single majority governments extremely well, securing powerful portfolios and having control over aspects of economy like plantations. Minister of plantation, that's a big thing for a country that produces tea, one of the finest teas in the world. So that engagement was different. These two groups never really identified with each other. And I think towards the end, when peace talks happened, the LTT did make an attempt with that sole representative of the Tamil people thing to extend. But there are many reasons as to why the Northern Tamil would not want to be the representative of the central province, Tamil of Indian origin.
I see. Interesting. We have somewhat of similar equation herein, as in ethnic minority parties, the Malays-based parties, they are also in position of kingmakers. It's a question of would they do that with that power, but they are in that position. So now moving on to the question of post-war reconciliation, what has that been like? While following the news, I could see issues of devolution and transitional justice pop up in Sri Lanka. In Nepal's case as well, as part of post-conflict restructuring, we transition into federal governance. Additionally, we are also in the process of tabling the Truth and Reconciliation Bill in the Parliament, albeit a bit too late.
Okay. See, the original call of the Tamil people also included federalism, a federal state. So the 13th Amendment, which was the brainchild of, it is a spin-off of this peace accord. So you want to devolve power, and I think that's a very important watershed moment in politics. Sri Lanka has, as we discussed, had these provincial kingdoms, but then we became unified and we only could see one single country. And I think it's all right to see Sri Lanka as one single country, but at the same time, there is a real need to share power with all the people in this country, not just Tamils. There are Muslims, there are Burghers. We have driven the Burghers out of this country as well. Yeah, with the language policy, we also made it impossible for them to
group. So what did you mention? Burghers?
We call them the Sri Lankan Burghers, but they are people of Dutch and Portuguese origin, largely Dutch. And they have contributed to Sri Lanka's architecture and arts in a big way. But we have been dispossessing people for the longest possible time in quite a shameful story.
Is there an attempt towards post-war reconciliation right now?
No, this was like, post-independence. But in post-war...
Post-2009, yeah.
Yeah. So the attempt was to, after the 13th Amendment, one of the biggest grievances was that the 13th Amendment was never truly implemented by the single state. We have never really, even when we set up the Northern Council, the Chief Minister, who, I speak to him.
Sorry, for our listener, the 13th Amendment talked about
devolution of power.
It was in 1987.
Yeah. So, and then you have these 9 provinces, and then you have a Chief Minister, and you have a provincial council for each of the states. So technically, the requirement comes from the north, right? So it's very critically important to show your commitment by setting it up. So, yes, it was done. So, there is a Northern Provincial Council. Varadaraja Perumal was the first Chief Minister. We talk
of Northern Province.
We talk a lot. Very interesting. A very interesting historical figure he is. He kept on coming to Colombo to, make sure that this becomes a functional reality.
Yeah.
And he has told this to me in a number of interviews. And eventually, he's remembered for declaring a separate state and, raising the flag and saying that this is a separate state. Why? Colombo drove him to that desperate level. So we have never been true to the idea of sharing power. Now you have provincial councils. And a lot of people don't feel it's an important political, body because they don't really truly serve the people and they're seen as white elephants. It's important to see that the one thing, our unit of devolution is the province. Yeah. And then we never really feed it. We never really make it take root and function. So all these aspirational things that have been lost in the annals of time contribute to our unhappiness, collective unhappiness. And then we have the war. And obviously, our engagement in terms of the Sri Lankan state with the LTT in talks is, it's rooted in suspicion. Everybody thinks that, you're really not going to make a good bargain. You're just out there to, crush the other. So all that distrust, and then you have the end of the war. Wars create victors and vanquished. Yeah. And for this proud Tamil race, I think it was really, you lose your opportunity, your bargaining clout. Without the LTT, you lose your bargaining clout. So, and then you talk about transitional justice. At the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa's government was hell-bent on bringing the war to an end. And people were tired. There was war fatigue. I'm sure the war fatigue is common to the south and the north. Perhaps more to the north. We didn't hear them too much. So in that sense, I think most people felt at some point this had to come to an end. But it was a very violent end, which according to the UN estimated over 60,000 people's lives being lost and many, many thousand missing. So in that, you try to introduce these mechanisms, but why? The mechanisms are something that some of the Sinhalese and some of the Tamils may have wanted, or the international order. So there was a lot of international pressure to move to the second level. Unfortunately for Mahinda Rajapaksa, there was no real honest commitment to make sure that we transition from the war phase to a post-war and transformative phase where we actually start working with the Tamil people, win their trust, become one country, which is what you wanted. So I don't think there was political commitment even at that stage. So these were mechanisms that he was not even considering all of that. We always say that he could have been the Nelson Mandela of Sri Lanka. It's just that he ended up being Robert Mugabe. This is something that a lot of people say. But it was much later, these mechanisms came when President Maithripala Sirisena and the current president, Prime Minister at that time, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, he believed in that. And they wanted these mechanisms. So it wasn't as if the Rajapaksas were, interested in pushing peace. They were only interested in ending the war.
I see. A bit of small follow-up with the devolution and provinces. In Nepal, we have provinces, but then there's still a question of devolving power. Things are centralized. Is it the same in Sri Lanka as well? Like, you already are divided into provinces. The question is, them having power to govern themselves, or is it that you still have to walk around the first bit about
the central government?
Is that conversation still up, or that's a settled one?
Well, it's the mapping of it is done.
I see.
The power sharing is not done. You have power. Technically, you have power. You don't have police power. You don't have power over lands. Because this whole territorial thing is a huge issue for Sri Lanka. But you're still working around the central government. And so you have the central government, and always the provincial councils have to work with the central government. For other provinces, it's not an issue. But I think it's a huge come down for those who wanted a separate state and wanted autonomy. That word autonomy doesn't even figure anymore.
I see. It's somewhat similar. I think we have technically divided into provinces, but the powers just aren't there. We have failed to operationalize it through regulations, rules. Though our constitution imagines somewhat of power sharing structure, but when it comes to drafting those regulations and acts,
So you have a schedule of powers? Like we have a schedule of powers.
We have,
this is what is
yes,
devolved.
But it's very blurry. You have overlapping mandates, and then for that to operationalize, you need regulations, and therein the central government comes in and puts it all under their control. So that has been one of the pivotal things regarding our federalism story. Yeah, we have power division, but that hasn't been operationalized. Yeah, so center, has majority of it, and the provinces are just helpless. And now, moving on to a bit of a tangential question, but I think it's something we can learn from Sri Lanka's experience. In Nepal, due to the current instability brought in by coalition politics, there has been a growing call for an executive presidency. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, has shifted from the Westminster system to a more of a French-like system of the executive presidency. How has that experience with executive presidency been like in Sri Lanka? On what aspect do you think it has helped, and where do you think it can be a disadvantage? Please feel free to highlight both development and human rights related aspect vis-a-vis executive presidency.
One of the most contentious topics in Sri Lankan politics would be the executive presidency. So you're right, it's very de Gaulleist, our constitution, right? So we have a very de Gaulleist executive president who has lots of power. Lots of power concentrated on one single individual. So it is like the dance of the prima donna, right? You dance around. We, of course, have a parliamentary system. We have an executive president. We have a cabinet of ministers. So that's how the government functions. The president is also the head of the cabinet. Right? And that's important. And the president also retains at least two key, this tradition, this is not written, but then they all have retained defense and finance. Yeah. So control over a lot of things. And also the executive president is also the head of armed forces.
I see.
Right. So whenever you want, you can mobilize the military. Since J.R. Jayawardena's ascendancy, and he created this position. He's a very interesting lawyer. So everyone else who followed him promised to abolish it. But we still have an executive president. So those who get to that position understand it's a lot of power. Commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and control over your public finance through the finance portfolio and of defense, which I can understand. So that's a lot of power. And also the right to appoint people. This has got diluted later with the 19th Amendment, which was once again destroyed by the Rajapakshas because we amended that too. 19th Amendment created a space for independent public commissions like the police. All of that has been undone much later. So it is a very powerful position where one person is capable of making a lot of decisions on behalf of the people. So people understand it's too much power in the hands of one man, except in one instance we haven't had a woman. They all have excesses as a result. We have spoken about the political the various parties have in their manifestos promised to abolish. It's one of the most popular slogans. We will abolish executive presidency. And we never do it. And I think those who get to that point enjoy the power. This is an election year in Sri Lanka. But I don't see this even becoming a promise.
Interesting. We here in Nepal are frustrated with our Westminster system where you need coalition to run the government. You or Sri Lanka on the other end, it seems that you guys are frustrated with executive presidency where president has a lot of power, right? So...
Well, the president is able to come to parliament, but he's not part of parliament. So he sits a level above. And therefore, the parliamentary politics, where you need a majority, what happens is if a presidential election, this is practically, if you go for a presidential election and one person gets elected, his
so people
or her
vote
party vote for psychological, right?
People
so
vote for the president. People.
Yeah, vote for the president. And then president can represent a party. He is or she is representing a political party. So that party wins and then the candidate becomes president. And then invariably that person's party gets the parliamentary majority. If not, you cobble a coalition. But we haven't seen very shaky coalitions. Power attracts power. And quickly the smaller parties come. As I told you, the kingmakers, they have got diluted, but there are other kingmakers. So they slowly convert themselves into these groups. And somehow they cobble, if you don't have the majority in the house, you create functional majorities. It's not as if we have not seen it collapse, but we have not been so shaky. Like there was a time in India, like you'd see the government collapse like, pack of cards every 3 months.
We have it here.
No, we don't have it. We haven't seen too much of that. No.
And just logically speaking, the position of executive presidency, I guess, it also invites a lot of populistic politics because people vote for you directly. So you're there to charm them and, it attracts big personality who might not necessarily be democratic. Is that so? How has that experience been like?
Okay, that's a very interesting question because we are actually talking about the individual.
I see, yeah.
There is individual style. Each president will have his or her way. So we have seen one female president, Chandrika Kumaratunga, everyone else been a man, and their styles have been different. Ranasinghe Premadasa was different to J.R. Jayawardena, and now Ranil Wickramasinghe, who is also the nephew of J.R. Jayawardena, is very different. And Maithripala Sirisena was also different. So they were very different. Their priorities could also be somewhat different focus areas. The issue is that so much of power in the hands of one can create very kleptocratic, authoritarian rulers. You were talking about 1983 and violence. J.R. Jayawardena is blamed for unleashing violence on the Tamils under his watch. He let it happen. And this is recorded history that the government allowed 3 days of violence to continue before they stepped in. And that's fact. So you can actually use it to crush somebody, crush a group, oppose dissent. Think we have a very good taste of it. It's quite bitter in our mouths.
I see. Something to learn for us then. Yeah. Now we move on to questions regarding international organization. I think they've been a big player in Sri Lanka and Nepal likewise. Here, I just wanted to understand what sort of roles international organization, be it UN, EU, and others, have played historically in resolving minority grievances and how effective have they been. I recently read how the president is pushing for ethnic reconciliation, partly resulting from pressures from these international organizations who tie economic assistance and trade-related assistance with human rights issues. In Nepal's case, personally, what I've observed is somewhat of a cyclical pattern. In the early years of Maoist war, when the minority voices were not mainstream, international organizations were relatively quieter about minority rights-related issues. The focus was more on service delivery, focusing on health or education. But then when there was a strong movement here in Nepal internally, and subsequently when Nepal went through a period of state restructuring, international organizations were very active in raising issues regarding minority rights. And at this current point, when the conversation regarding state restructuring, at least on paper, appears to be a settled issue and traditional forces have regained power, international organizations haven't been very active on minority rights related issues. They have again started focusing more on issues of service delivery or promoting growth, right? So is this cyclical pattern somewhat similar to what you have experienced in Sri Lanka, or is it somewhat different?
Can I ask you a counter question?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think in our countries power shifts are so organic, or is there a measure of external pressure and influence? If not pressure, there is some influence.
It's something I've been thinking about. I don't know if domestic actors influence international politics or international politics influence domestic actors. I see a lot of things happening one way, and I also have a lot of other examples of things happening other way. So it's just like everyone, they play their cards. Sometimes one forces can make the other move. Sometimes other forces can make other forces move. Right now, what I've seen is our government, it's filled by traditional forces, and they have a stronger bargaining power when engaging with the international organization. That can be good, bad. I'm not going to comment on it. So right now, they are able to somewhat direct where we need assistance. And previously, when we were in the phase of state restructuring, that wasn't the case because our internal politics was itself fluid. And at that point, international partners, they could influence domestic politics. So I see it being somewhat of a cyclical pattern. At one point, someone can get upper hand, at others. That's my reading based on Nepali politics. I'd love to hear yours.
I think when you're a small state,
Yeah.
there are different dynamics.
Yeah.
And not to play the victim card, but to understand that how do we leverage the little power, the soft power that we may have, plus various ways in which to bargain with the big powers. They're so important at all times. So President Jayawardena was not making India happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was making India extremely unhappy. So this is understood.
So he was president when?
In the 80s.
I see, yeah.
So the IPKF came to Sri Lanka and the peace accord was signed when he was in power. He was the first executive president. I just wanted to make an example. So, to these power blocks do have a lot to do in propping up the person. And also, you're talking about the international agencies and about addressing grievances. So when Sri Lanka went into this phase of engaging with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the talks were facilitated by the Norwegians. And I always think there's no free lunch. There really isn't. And so that alone became very suspicious for some people because, the conspiracy theories that people love to think about and Western influence, all these things are there. This is international power play. You know what? It's always there. It's our reality. And when you're a small state, it's really more prevalent and we feel it. Having said that, it's up to us to navigate those not so great, waters as best as we can. So peace talks had this whole Norwegian context. And you're right, the Western aid was always linked to a number of things, like the GSP Plus, the preferential concessions by the EU, is linked to human rights. So, they say that we would not support you if your human rights record is really bad. And then, of course, the US aid, that's the other big player. Every country and their aid agencies would have a certain position, and I don't see any problem with that, as long as you understand and the positions are clear. But today, the trajectory is different after the economic collapse. The focus and support is now on taxation and growth and recovery. And Sri Lanka is in that phase with the IMF bailout. So it's changed.
But do they also apply the condition of human rights?
Well, not that traditional set of human rights. Now this is about service delivery, cutting on corruption. So we had a very interesting diagnostic tool. The first time Sri Lanka became a case study for the IMF. And it does say that, even the benefits given to the poor is not rightfully given. And the fact that there are a lot of political beneficiaries, which is true.
And the emergence of China, has it sort of altered the equation that you guys had with traditional donors? Because China usually doesn't factor human right related commitments when giving aid. So has that changed the equation with Western donors also, Sri Lanka's relationship? How much do Sri Lankan leaders use China or, as they say, play China card?
Many cards. It's an interesting question, but a very common one. It's easy to understand that the Indo-Pacific, the neighborhood first, and then BRI, all having their own line to push. The game is for Sri Lanka to play well and to manage all these three. Now, the United States has been a long-standing friend of Sri Lanka, if you may call it a friend. President Jayawardena was very West-leaning. He looked to the West for development support, and this did not make India happy. So our friction with India has a huge history, and President Jayawardena did not make the neighbor happy. Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia to have an open economy. And then, so we started working with the European nations, and there was European aid. And he had a very good relationship with Japan. So we had a lot of Japanese aid. So that's how the donor-dependent economy was created. And then about China. So you're right, they don't ask questions. For a country that has been historically working with European Western donors and also with the United States, then you have a situation where in 2005, when President Mahinda Rajapaksa becomes the president, he wants to grow. He wants Sri Lanka to grow and the war to end. I think, to be fair, there were two thrusts to his government. The conceptualizing of his regime. He lost himself and the government lost its way later on, for sure, and were contributing to this huge economic collapse because they did not know what they were doing. But one was to end the war, the other one was to have a quick development trajectory, and this infrastructure development is Bree's main thing, right?
Yeah.
So we were working with China suddenly, and all those uncomfortable questions about human rights, which the Rajapakshas had a plenty to deal with, because of the war. So why do you work with these countries and make you uncomfortable when there is a country that doesn't ask you questions and give you high interest loans to even service your vanity projects? We know what has happened. The final outcome of this China's presence has made India and the United States obviously worry. So we have a situation. At a point, I remember President Rajapaksa in an interview said that we play China against India and India against China. Yeah? He didn't play India against China too well, I would say. Yeah, he was almost anti-India, and India did not necessarily feel that the Rajapakshas were very India-friendly. And so when you're reliant on one single country and all your development work is linked to Chinese support, obviously other countries do worry. Everybody wants a presence. Everybody wants a stake. So from United States to India to China, everybody is there and in competition. My problem is not about them wanting to compete, that Sri Lanka becoming their battleground. If you're smart, you will play it well and get the US, China and India all to support and pursue your agenda, which is what Sri Lankan leaders should have done. If they did that, 2022 wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's all about using what you have
Leverage.
to get. It's just that at times they use that to gain like domestic credibility and win votes.
Very populous at that time.
Yeah, here also anti-India sentiments. Politicians use it to gather votes rather than it being something strategic. So now I just wanted to focus a bit on India. You said some bit previously, just capturing India's position on Sri Lanka's ethnic politics. So historically, they have been heavily involved, starting from creating an atmosphere for the 13th Amendment that devolved power in 1987. The question is, have they maintained similar sort of engagement at present as well, or how has their engagement changed? So it's just similar dynamic playing out with India right now.
I think nothing stays the same.
I see.
If you thought China was your friend, in the financial crisis time, we realized when the whole thing collapsed, China wasn't your friend. We couldn't negotiate those loans. We couldn't delay those payments. It was like Shylock come to your house and saying like, we are demanding our pound of flesh and you got to deliver. But if that is their policy, I wouldn't fault China. I would say that the Sri Lankan leaders should have known who you're engaging with and on what terms. Likewise, India's relationship has evolved and it's never static. India can never be static, right? It's the closest neighbor, and there are good moments and bad moments, very friction and unhappiness. As someone who watches India closely and South Asia in general, I think Indian foreign policy has evolved, especially in the neighborhood first. So India is a believer, and its foreign policy is technically multipolar. There is no unipolarity possible because that's the Chinese position, right? Or the United States position. So in that, when you work with the neighbors, and I know India has a very contentious relationship with Nepal, the neighborhood first policy can sound nice, but not necessarily translate into real good action. Having said that, I would also come up with an exemption when the financial collapse happened. And I know it is of strategic interest to quickly get your, foot into Sri Lanka, and then start moving. But at the same time, that is also a neighbor. And so with regard to the mobilization of humanitarian assistance, supplies of food and medicine, and also the $4 billion that they contributed for Sri Lanka to stay afloat cannot be written off either. We were a desperate country at that moment. So India played a pivotal role. And sometimes I think because of the historical legacy and our contentious relationship, that some of these moments are lost. Some of the better moments are also lost. But then it is also, so what happens? Sri Lanka is vulnerable. Our economic vulnerability creates a place for India to come in and assist. But it's an extension of their foreign policy. And it's also an opportunity to get a better foothold and then to bargain for, management of certain resources of the country. So I would say the relationship at this given moment is slightly better than what it used to be. To be fair, I think Indian foreign policy has evolved. And even in that, how it deals with Nepal is not how it deals with Pakistan. How it deals with Sri Lanka would be different to how it deals with the Maldives. The problem is that big player in the neighborhood thing is always there. And as small states, we always feel that it is there.
Interesting. Just reiterating what you said, you mentioned India was a better friend financially in 2022 than China was. And I also heard Indian foreign minister suggesting Indian to, visit Sri Lanka, right? So that clip got viral.
We have Indian currency in Sri Lanka.
Oh, I
now.
see.
We never had. Now, I know it's used in this country, but it's not largely in circulation, but you can see. I was surprised. So this whole mobilization, it's a very interesting thing, how it's not just the tourists. That slowly, much of India becoming more present and visible. This is how it happens.
And regarding 30th Amendment, do you think India has a strategic interest to see it implemented? Because I've seen, recent news where, Indian counterparts, they were nudging the Sri Lankan government to, go through the 13th Amendment and devolve power. So is it a running issue or is it something, that just comes out sometimes?
3 years after this, it would be the 40th anniversary of the amendment. What do we have to show for it? And to bring the LTT to the table, many things had to be done. And also to have negotiated peace, to get to a point of a truce, we've seen years of escalation and of violence, but 13th Amendment, honestly implemented, could have at least sent out a signal that Colombo was honestly, genuinely concerned about sharing power and was willing to commit. We haven't really shown it. So clearly, as something that India supported, conceptualized, and to bring these two parties to the table, it's important for them to see 13th Amendment implemented fully and to see power devolution as a reality and to see negotiated peace. Peace that is not about the victor and the vanquished. And I think more than to India, to Sri Lankans it should matter because they are finally Sri Lankans. LTT is not a foreign army. Yeah, these people are Sri Lankans. So it is in our interest to share power.
And now to the final question. As someone who is heavily engaged in regional platforms, I wanted to understand your take, if asked to compare on civic space in different South Asian countries. You can perhaps highlight things more constructively if you want. It's just that I do not want to miss out the opportunity to hear from someone with so much regional experience in this field as you do.
In South Asia, people are losing their voice collectively. And I think there are things that Nepal should celebrate, that you have retained a sense of space and opportunity well and above other countries. And for that, you're a case study of inclusion and of also tolerance. That dissent is not something that somebody needs to go and kill you for. And that's huge because in the rest of South Asia, it isn't so. I see shrinking space for civil society and for journalists in a country that we used to celebrate for its democratic norms, and that's our neighboring India. And it makes practitioners very apprehensive. And think of any other country, another country that we don't know too much about, like Bhutan. And we all know there are Nepali-speaking refugees in Nepal, in your country.
Yeah.
So where is your tolerance and acceptance of people? And if you then move to Afghanistan, it's a complete collapse. Your critical voices are no longer within your country. You've driven them out. So I think we are
And
very
Bangladesh?
same case in point. I think a lot of people are leaving, finding it very difficult to freely express themselves. What are we saying? Are we having the kind of states who are unable to deal with dissent? You're not talking about militant groups. Here we are talking about people working at ground level, people who have a certain belief system and who would want to protect the democratic space to have those voices, right? And I think South Asia has a problem of tolerance and of accepting dissent to be part of democracy. What is democracy if you do not allow another voice?
Regarding Nepal's case, yesterday too, I kept hearing, Nepal as an example for having a vibrant civic space. We do have that. I feel that we can say anything, criticize any leaders, and I don't see having that big a repercussion. But then I wonder, do we believe on freedom of expression, having a healthy civic space value-wise, or it is just the case that we have many small factions, there is no dominant, ruler. That's why, we are enjoying this space, right? So that's a question for us to think about as well. And with this note, I would like to end the podcast. It was great having you here to hear your experiences as working journalist in Sri Lanka, as well as your experience of engaging in this sort of regional platform and giving more of that South Asian voice that we all need. So thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll get to have many such discussions in the future as well.
Thank you so much for having me. And I think South Asia needs to understand that we have our different voices and our collective voices. And unlike other regions, we are not collective. And it's something that South Asia should really seriously think about. So it's great that you're talking to people from the region and making these experiences shareable with others. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure was ours. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PI. I hope you enjoyed Susab's conversation with Dilrukshi on Thinking Sri Lanka, recalling legacies of conflict, domestic politics and aid. Today's episode was produced by Nirjan Rai with support from Kusi Hang and me, Hriday Sapkota. The episode was recorded at PI Studio and was edited by me, Hriday Sapkota. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Sakya from Jindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or wherever you listen to the show. For PI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PI. That's tweet followed by the number 2 and PI. And on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneursing. You can also visit pi.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Hriday. We'll see you soon in our next episode.